so I'm getting these words better, who has been actively investigating the unusual since 2008. The first 5 years of his investigative career were spent as a MUFON field investigator, and following that he investigated independently prior to becoming the head writer and editor for the Singular Fortean Society. He strives to separate himself from dogma in the pursuit of the unknown, and believes it is our experiential perspectives that allow us all to add to the base of knowledge, through which we gain deeper understanding of the paranormal. It's going to be a great presentation, isn't it?
Well, you've built it up a lot,
Okay.
so I hope so.
His years as an investigator have served him best by illustrating that when it comes to the anomalous, the preternatural, you're going to define that, aren't you?
Yeah, well, I'm a writer, so I don't write things to be spoken out loud.
Oh,
yeah.
Thank you. I
Yeah,
appreciate that. Yeah, those are the ones I would just skip over. My teacher would always say, look that up, and I would go, I know what he means. And the paranormal. Any answers he's found are still hopelessly outnumbered by questions. Isn't that true of us for our entire life? Please welcome Tobias Wayland.
Thank you, thank you. I'm overjoyed to be here, honestly, in this beautiful venue. And thank you, Jeff, for that wonderful introduction. So a little bit about myself. As he said, I'm Tobias Wayland, and along with my wife and partner, Emily, you can see her down there taking photographs, we founded the Singular Fortean Society in 2016. And so a little bit about that before we get started talking about the Lake Michigan Mothman. If you're not familiar with the word Fortean, a lot of people aren't, it comes from the early 20th century collector of weird news stories, Charles Fort. And so he would collect these weird news stories from all over the world, and he'd put them together into these collections, and he would draw parallels and examine them and sort of speculate on the nature of these phenomena and what might be behind them. And so that's similar to the approach that we like to take. Charles Fort very famously said, one measures a circle beginning anywhere. That is to say, only by examining the paranormal holistically can we really gain a better understanding of each individual phenomenon. And so a lot of people also ask about the word singular because most people associate it only with the number one, but it can also mean unique and remarkable. And so, of course, we like to think that our society is unique and remarkable, but more than that, we like to think that the Forteans who comprise our society are unique and remarkable because it is everybody's particular opinions and experiences and perspectives put together through which we can gain a greater understanding of paranormal phenomena. And so, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to a case that we've been working on since spring of 2017. Now, if you're not familiar with the Mothman of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, it's a pretty good place to start. Back in the 60s, from 1966 to 1967, residents of Point Pleasant, West Virginia reported a number of sightings of a strange bat or bird-like flying humanoid that would induce a type of terror and was perhaps best recognized for its glowing red eyes. And these sightings were investigated by a journalist and ufologist named John Keel and ended perhaps most famously in the tragic collapse of the Silver Bridge in December of 1967. Now, a lot of people associate Mothman with the collapse of that bridge and think that the phenomenon ended with the event. I'm not so sure. So, in the spring of 2017, I saw 3 sighting reports across my desk, each one reported to the Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON. And so, I'll just list these out for you, and then we can talk about the particular issues and where it led. The first sighting report was said to have taken place on April 15th, 2017 at around 10 p.m. A woman and her husband were out with some friends on a boat on Lake Michigan off of Montrose Beach. And as they were out there, she said that she noticed this giant bat flying above this boat. She said it circled the boat 3 times and then flew off. She said that she could see it silhouetted against the moon, and that's how she was able to gauge its size. And she estimated that it was somewhat larger than her husband, who himself stood at 6 foot 4 inches tall. She said that after the sighting of this large bat, that she then spotted a green light that she was sure was no airplane, determined that it was a UFO, and overcome with dread insisted that they return to the beach, and so reportedly they did. That same evening at 10:30 p.m., a witness said that he was hanging outside with his friends when he saw something that he described as a lechuza. If you're not familiar with that term, it is a folkloric Mexican witch who is said to be able to transform into a large bird, most often an owl, sometimes an eagle. And so they said that they saw this humanoid type large owl creature, and that it was standing there, and it had to be over 6 feet tall, and it had these glowing red eyes. The early morning hours of April 16th, 2017. Still that same night, but not technically the same day, at 2 a.m., a witness said that he arrived from work at the Chicago International Produce Market and saw a bunch of people standing in the parking lot looking at something. Now, he wasn't sure precisely what they were looking at, so of course he had to go investigate for himself, and he noticed what he described as a huge owl, supposedly flying over the parking lot, and he described its eyes as being bright yellowish or reddish, sort of like a cat, and he said that he and the other witnesses there threw rocks at it until it flew away. And so I was naturally curious about these, and I wrote an article about them for our website, and I even went so far as to talk to Sam Moranto, the state director for MUFON for the state of Illinois. And Sam had a few issues with these sightings. First and foremost, and I verified this myself with historical weather data, the moon wouldn't have been visible at the time of that first witness's sighting. Now, before we dismiss it too readily, I think it's important to understand that a lot of people aren't necessarily keeping too close of an eye on the clock when things like this happen, and she could have been confused, or she could have embellished her story to try to add extra details to make it seem more likely, because that's something else that we see quite often with people who have experienced these types of seemingly impossible events. The other issue that Sam had talked to me about was the latter two sightings, he said, came from the same IP address. Now, something important to note here, because I'm not aware of exactly how he came by the information of their IP address, but if it had come through email, the major email carriers will not give you someone's personal IP address. You're only ever able to see the IP address of the last major server that they went through from that email company. So it wouldn't be very surprising to me if the IP addresses were found through an email for both of them to be identical if they both came from a similar area, like the same city, in this case, Chicago. Now, if that would have been the only cases that I had seen, I would have added them to my shrug file and moved on with my life, frankly. But they weren't. After we ran this story, Phantoms and Monsters, another paranormal website, ran it. UFO Clearinghouse ran the similar story on these sightings. And reports started flooding in, dozens and dozens and dozens. And we ended up, by 2019, really to date, with somewhere around 100 reports from people all over Lake Michigan who have reported similar phenomena or related phenomena. And rather than try to go through all of those in the time allotted, why don't I start with two cases that I think are fairly representative of what we received from witnesses in Chicago. So these occurred on Lakeview and Ashland Avenue, respectively. Both cases involve witnesses who saw something strange and then were led to the website Phantoms and Monsters through a quick Google search. So May 27th at 7:30 p.m., a woman and a boyfriend said that they saw a large black flying man with wings near Ashland Avenue. They said that it was flying without flapping its wings and that it was backlit by the moon. And when I checked historical weather data at that time, I saw that at the time of their sighting it was mostly cloudy and the moon was waxing crescent. So it would have been visible in the sky, and it's possible then that what they were saying about it being backlit by the moon could be true. And then, of course, when they got home, they searched the internet and were led to Phantoms and Monsters, where they made their report. That same evening at 10:30 p.m., a husband and his wife were walking home from dinner near Lakeview Avenue, in Chicago, when they saw a large bat-like creature with glowing red eyes flying about 15 feet off the ground, as they reported. Now, they went out of their way to mention that this didn't look like any bird they had seen before. And the husband specifically said that he felt like it was something out of this world. Again, the wife did a quick internet search, and she found other sighting reports, and that led her to Phantoms and Monsters, where she made her report. So, before I get into the really weird stuff, we're going to have to talk about birds, because the fact is, the destruction of wetland habitats mean that more herons are living in developed areas, and climate change means that herons are migrating north sooner, and they're staying north longer. So, herons are migratory birds, and they're most often found in the states bordering, Lake Michigan from spring until fall, which, interestingly, if you look at the timeline of these reports from 2017 through 2018, the majority of the reports fall between spring and autumn. So climate change, again, has affected these birds' migration patterns, and that's measurable. That is measurable in a way that we can put into pretty easy numbers. So for instance, between 2009 and 2016, the number of paired black-crowned night herons living in Lincoln Park jumped from 24 to 300. And that's in Lincoln Park in Chicago. That's in the middle of the city. And so I don't think that it's a coincidence that the following spring, people are suddenly reporting this weird flying creature that they can't explain. I think that, quite simply, when people tell us that they were seeing something they had never seen before and that they didn't understand, I believe them. I think they were. And there are a few sightings that I think can be explained in this way. So Calumet Park, I think, is a great example. April 27th, 7:30 p.m., a man and his son were leaving the Little Calumet River after an afternoon of fishing. The man said that he heard a sound like train brakes, like the screeching of train brakes, and that he saw something big and black fly overhead. He described it as being as big as a full-grown man and said that its wingspan was right around 10 feet tall. On May 5th, at 8 p.m., a man and his son in Calumet Park were hiking, and they saw what they at first thought was a goose fly overhead. But as they looked at this thing, they said that it looked like a human figure about 6 feet in height and estimated that it had about an 8-foot wingspan. So now we can see, by looking at these witness reports, that there are aspects of this that are very similar to things like herons. So that screeching, like train brakes, you can go online right now and go to YouTube and literally look up what a great blue heron sounds like, and that's a pretty apt description, frankly. And their wingspans get up to 8 feet. I think it's forgivable if you sort of account for the perceptual variance between individuals, that somebody would mistake that for 10. This actually was taken by a guy who was willing to go on the record. His name is John Amatrano. And he was a security person at the Owl at that time, and he said he was outside smoking a cigarette. He said he was alone, but there were a few other people on the street, and quite unfortunately, he had forgotten his phone outside when he went out to smoke. He said as he was outside smoking, he noticed a large bat-like creature flying just above the streetlights in the empty lot across the street. He said that it was roughly humanoid in appearance, that it looked to be about 5 to 5.5 feet long and grayish in color. He said that the head looked human-like, but thinner, and that it had a pointed crest extending from the back. He said that it had short legs tucked up underneath it, and he approximated the wingspan at about 8 to 10 feet. He said that the wings looked roughly bat-shaped but heavy, and compared them to those of a pterosaur, so think pterodactyl there. Now, about a mile east of the Owl is the Chicago River, and a couple miles beyond that is Lake Michigan. Now, a lot of people don't like to hear about the large birds because they're not weird and they're not necessarily paranormal, although I think that there's room for that in this, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And a lot of people are very dubious of that explanation, and frankly, they don't like to hear it. And to those people, I have to tell them about this sighting in Pilsen. So, May 9th, 2018, a man was bicycling to work in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago. And as he was biking along, he saw a man and a woman standing on a street corner, and the man was pointing to something in the sky. And so, naturally, he looked up. He was curious to see what they were so excited about. And he saw what he described as either a large Batman or perhaps a person in a wingsuit. Now, I spoke to this guy, and he was sincere. I'm convinced of his sincerity, and that the account that he gave me was authentic to his experience. And luckily, this witness had a GoPro camera attached to his helmet. And so he decided he was going to follow this thing around. He was going to get as much footage as he can, and then he was going to send it out to every, investigative organization he could find already covering this story. And so he got in contact with us. He was kind enough to send us this video. We worked with him. We got a few really good stills of the creature he had seen. And this is what we ended up with. So now you can see the circled object there. That is the creature that he had seen. And there it is enlarged. We, of course, went into Photoshop and just blew it up a little bit. Here it is again. And enlarged. And one more time. This is probably the best one. And enlarged. I don't know what that looks like to you, but to me that is clearly a bird. And, he was a little disappointed, I think. And I think that he may have been a little embarrassed. He actually apologized to me and said that he was sorry for wasting my time. And to that, I could only say, of course you weren't wasting my time. Because we have to get reports like this, frankly, it's important. Without getting reports like this and without witnesses like this guy coming forward and providing us with this, we wouldn't have a complete picture of what's happening here. So, I'd also like to talk about my friend Vance's sighting. Now, Vance is actually a paranormal investigator, and he's been working with us to investigate these cases. And when he was outside of work one day, March 29th, 2018, he was on his lunch break, and it was about 12:30. And, he works in St. Charles, Illinois, which is about 40 miles west of Chicago. And as he's outside on his lunch break, he noticed something in the sky that caught his attention. And he immediately recognized it as an enormous bird. So he naturally runs inside and he grabs his cell phone camera and he takes a few photographs. He said that this bird was bigger than anything he'd ever seen. He said that because of his experience working in the aeronautics field, one of his hobbies is identifying things in the air, and so he's sort of used to gauging the size of things, and he approximated the wingspan of whatever this was to be about 8 feet. As a sort of amateur ornithologist, he had decided that he could rule out, something like a sandhill crane, any kind of eagle or vulture just based on its size. And that, he suspected that it wasn't a heron, but couldn't necessarily rule it out. And so, just to show you a little bit of what we're talking about, this is a black-crowned night heron. You can see that it's got red eyes. It's got about a 4-foot wingspan and usually stands about 2 feet tall. And a great blue heron, which stand about 4 feet tall and have, about a 7-foot wingspan, frankly. And interestingly enough, if you look at the profile of those photographs, you'll see that whatever was photographed had its head tucked back, which is exactly how great blue herons fly. Now, this is always everybody's favorite stuff, and it's probably my favorite stuff too. And now that we got past the birds, we can get into the weird stuff, and there's plenty. And we'll start, I think, with the little village. Now, these sightings, and I want to be very clear about this, in stark contrast to the misidentified bird sightings that we've already seen. These sightings, if you believe the witnesses, and I have no reason not to, couldn't possibly be a misidentified large bird species like a great blue heron or something similar. They just couldn't, and I think that you'll see why. So this actually is a sketch that was received from a witness who lives in Chicago's little village. That witness's sighting took place on September 26, 2017 at about 9:15 p.m. When a mother and son saw what they described as a monster bat in the backyard of their house. So at about that time of night, they heard their neighbor's dog barking like crazy, and they decided to turn on the porch light and looked out their back door to see exactly what the dog was on about. And what they saw was this, according to their description. They said that the son saw it for about 10 seconds. The mother saw it for about 2 because as soon as she laid eyes on this thing, she collapsed immediately in fear. And she was so frightened, actually, that she really didn't want anything to do with this. She didn't really want to talk about it. Her son was willing to talk about it, but she just wanted to move on. And so this thing that they saw was standing in front of their garage, and so they were able to sort of approximate its dimensions based on that. And so based on it standing with its wings spread out in front of their garage, they estimated its wingspan to be about 12 to 15 feet, and that, you know, it was somewhere between 6 and 7 feet tall. Next we have Mugwanago, Wisconsin. So about the middle of April 2017, around the same time as the sightings were beginning, ostensibly beginning really, in Chicago, a man in Mugwanago, Wisconsin, which is about 45 minutes outside of Milwaukee, was on his way home and he's speaking to his friend on the phone. And you know, when he got home, since he was living with his parents at the time, he decided that he wanted to continue the conversation, finish the conversation outside, because he didn't want to go inside talking loudly on the phone with his friend and risk waking his parents up. And so that seemed pretty polite. And he parked in his driveway, facing the street. It was a gravel driveway. And as he was standing there, he noticed, backlit in the ambient light of this lamppost that they have at the end of their driveway, was a silhouette of a humanoid shape. And so he turns on his headlights, and in his headlights, he sees what he described as a humanoid bat dragon. He said that this thing had scaly skin, and that he could really tell that it was scaly because of the fact that it had been misting out all day, and he could see the water sort of reflecting off of its scales. And of course, I verified all of that weather data, and it was accurate. That day, that is what the weather was like. And he said that he sat there in stunned silence for several seconds, and then he recounted to his friend on the phone as it was happening what he was seeing. And his friend, of course, didn't believe him at first. His friend thought he was giving him the business, but it didn't take him very long to recognize the fear in his voice. And at that point, he did believe it. And his friend said so, frankly, that he didn't know exactly what this guy had seen, but he knew that it had scared the crap out of him. And so he stood there looking at this thing, and this thing looking at him, and he estimated that it was maybe 8 or 9 feet tall, and he didn't get a wingspan on it because he said that it was standing there, and it had its wings crossed across its body like this. So if you can picture a bat, you know, how they hang upside down in caves with their wings crossed in front of them, only standing in front of you, that was its posture. And he said that it seemed to blur very quickly, and then it was just gone. And so he wasn't sure if that meant that it had just flown away faster than his eye could register, if it had disappeared, if it had teleported, who knows. And that was it. He didn't spend a lot more time outside that evening. In fact, he understandably rushed inside, and then sometime later he got a hold of us, and we were able to go out there and speak to him. And I can tell you that I can recount these reports to you. What I cannot do is replicate the fear that is so readily apparent in these people months after these incidents. And that is the defining contrast between the weird sightings and the misidentified bird sightings. The people who see the misidentified birds, they don't report the fear. They don't report the feeling of being watched before they even knew something was there. They don't report living in terror. And when you speak to them, they're not still frightened by these events. They don't carry them with them like the actual paranormal ones. And so you can see here, that is the witness's van, and that's where it was parked that evening. This is me. Now, I'm 6'2", and this is the view that he would have had looking out of his windshield. And so he put the top of the creature's head at about up here, at just about the top of his windshield, and that's where he got that 8 to 9 foot tall estimate. You can see there, from where the van was parked, this is the lamppost that was on, that would have been shedding the ambient light by which he saw the silhouette of this thing. So he first recognized it. And then if you've never been to Mukwonago, this is kind of what Mukwonago looks like. There's not a lot there. It's a very rural community. It's relatively isolated. And it's exactly the kind of place where things like this happen, frankly. Another place where things like this seem to happen is Woodstock, Illinois. So Woodstock, Illinois is a suburb of Chicago, about 35 miles west of Lake Michigan. February 22nd of this year, a man said that while he was returning home from the drugstore, and I'd like to point out that a lot of these sightings, they represent what I like to call interrupted journeys. And that's sort of a callback to John Fuller and his book on the Betty and Barney Hill case, which was appropriately titled The Interrupted Journey. But many people, they're out and they're going about their business when they run headlong into the impossible, frankly. And that's exactly what happened to this guy. He had to run out to Walgreens, of all things. It was 8 p.m. on February 22nd, just a normal day. And as he's headed home, he sees what he described as a strange bipedal creature crossing the road from Dewfield Pond right in front of his car, and he sees it illuminated in his headlights. He said that it took up about approximately a third of the width of the road, estimated its height at about 8 to 9 feet tall, and said that part of it looked leathery, but that wasn't necessarily the best word to describe it, he said. And that's another important aspect of these cases that I think people need to understand, is the inability of people to accurately describe what they're seeing. People struggle to have the vocabulary to describe these things that are so far outside of human experience that they can't even begin to understand what they had just seen. And that was sort of the issue here. He said that this thing was covered in dark fur, and at first he thought it might be something like a Sasquatch. I mean, he didn't know. But then he saw these membranous, what he described as gargoyle-like wings coming off of its back. Now, shortly after this, on March 6th, at about 1:30 a.m., we heard from a woman who said that she heard these weird, what she described as animalistic, demonic growling noises outside of her house. This was also in Woodstock, less than 2 miles northwest of Dewfield Pond. Now, normally I wouldn't associate this with anything else happening in that area, but I think as Forteans we have to include it. Can't say that it had anything to do necessarily with this man's sighting or any of the others in this area, but I think we have to consider that maybe it did. Now, March 7th, the day after, a report was received from a woman who said that she had seen a similar creature on Rose Farm Road, also in Woodstock, Illinois. Now, her mother actually reported this on her behalf. We were never able to speak to that witness. Her mother said that she was terrified, and quite frankly, she didn't want to talk about it. And so she was unwilling to come forward altogether. Now, this is a silhouette that was provided to us by that initial witness on February 22nd. And so you can sort of see what he was talking about, the humanoid shape, the gargoyle-like wings extending from its back. He said that these little yellow lights here, or these yellow scribbles at the bottom, were meant to represent his car headlights. And so that'll give you an approximate just an approximation, I think, of what he was describing. And so, of course, Emily and I went down there. That took a little convincing, by the way. His wife initially reported this on his behalf, and she had to convince him to come forward, and we had to convince him that we weren't looking to take advantage of him and we were going to protect their privacy. And eventually he relented and was willing to let us come down. And at that point, I think, when we were able to convince him that we just wanted to help, was when they really became very, very helpful themselves, and we really appreciated that. So we went down there, and now this is a photograph that they said they found, or I'm sorry, a footprint that they said they found the next day. I don't think this is anything paranormal, quite frankly. I think that now Dewfield Pond was not technically open at this time, but it was still a relatively popular walking area, and so people would take their dog and their dogs and things there. And I think that what this was that they found the next day is probably somebody's boot print. This is definitely somebody's boot print. And then these are, clearly dog tracks. And so whatever this was, which I think it was probably somebody's boot print, regardless, has been corrupted by, everything else that has happened around it and on top of it, to the point where, it's not doing us a whole lot of good. But when we were there, I noticed this, and now I understand that this is difficult to see, which is why I drew a little outline of it to try to make it a little clearer. So I noticed, as they were showing us around this conservation area, what looked like a distorted humanoid footprint. And it was in the ice, which meant that there was not going to be any good way for us to record this outside of a photograph. And so that's what we did. If you look in the lower right-hand corner here, you can see my size 12 boot to give you sort of an approximate idea of how big this was. And there were what appeared to be articulated toes at the end of it. Now, this is a solitary print. And, there were a couple of explanations that came immediately to mind. And the one that was the most mundane, I think, was, now it had been a little warmer out than is normal for that time of year. And so I considered the fact that perhaps somebody with those barefoot running shoes might have been running in the conservancy or the conservation area, and maybe they had left a footprint, and maybe it had been distorted, melted a little bit by the sun, and so this is what we ended up with. But I thought that was strange because it was the only one, and I considered that, if they had actually been out there running and this represented somebody doing something mundane like going for a jog, why weren't there more? It reminded me, really, nothing more than those reports of Bigfoot prints that we receive, that people find in the middle of the woods, that will be 2 or 3 prints long, beginning seemingly out of nowhere and ending in the same place. And so I thought that was odd. Make of that what you will. Now, just to give you a better idea of the witness's perspective, now this is the entrance to the Dewfield Pond Conservation Area. And he said that the thing that he had seen ran through here. And behind this house is the McHenry County Fairground. And then it's a bunch of woods and sort of rural area. And so this is the entrance to the conservation area looking in. And this is the conservation area itself. It's about 78 acres in size. So, not inconsiderable. And, one of the frustrating things about these reports has been sort of a lack of something tangible that I can point to, that I can show people to show them how seriously these witnesses take these sightings. Now, very luckily, luckily for us, maybe not as luckily for the witness, we ended up with this. This is an incident detail report. And this came out of a sighting that took place on February 28th at about 2:46 a.m. And we were told about this sighting via email. A young man contacted us and said that he thought he had seen the same thing that the initial witness had seen on February 22nd. He said that he was outside of the Jewel Osco, another drugstore, I think, and he was looking across the parking lot into the McHenry County Fairground, which, if you'll remember, was the path that this thing would have taken across the street between that house and the tree line, and yeah, it was the direct line path. So he said he was out there and he saw this thing that he described very similarly to our first witness, and he said that, you know, it was about 8 to 9 feet tall, similarly furry, similar gargoyle-like wings, and he said that it had these greenish glowing eyes, and he said that it charged the fence, and when it did, he was so terrified that he called 911, and they sent a sheriff's deputy to investigate. And, you know, naturally I asked this guy if he thought he could get me a copy of the police report, and he said that he could, and then I never heard anything else out of him. So, you know, I submitted my own FOIA request, and the McHenry County Sheriff's Department was polite enough to send me this, and it tells exactly the story that I just told you. Now, I've redacted this witness's personal information. I've also redacted the name of the sheriff's deputy involved, because none of these people ever gave me permission to use their names, and even though this is public information, you could track it down if you wanted to, I don't think ethically I should facilitate that. But we do have it. We have this police report that shows that this guy was so scared, he took his sighting so seriously, that he called 911. And somebody came out and investigated it, and he didn't find a monster, but he did find a very scared witness. And so, out of those sightings, and the relative popularity of those sightings, we received one more of a lot of interest to me. And so, this actually came from a woman named Paula, who's a wonderful woman, who lived in Wakanda, Illinois, which is nearby Woodstock. It's about 20 miles east of the Dewfield Pond Conservation Area. And she told me that on April 20th, 2014, at about 11 p.m., she was sitting near a window in the bedroom of her ground level apartment. And this is near the Lakewood Forest Preserve in Wakanda, as I said. And she saw what she described as a bright beam of light that just came shooting down across the street. So she said that this light, which lasted between 15 and 20 seconds, was an orangish gold color, and that, strangely, it didn't illuminate its surroundings at all. So, you know, I don't picture a searchlight or anything that might actually light an area up. This really was more of a solid light construct, I think, would be the best way to picture it. And she said it didn't really move around much. It just sort of slid side to side, and then it retracted back up, only to reappear a moment later. And when that happened, Paula told me that she fell back in shock and fear, because in that moment, she thought that whatever this was, whatever she was seeing, this strange light, or whatever the strange light's origin was, knew she was there. She thought that it had become aware of her. And so she said that, you know, what she was thinking was, oh my God, this thing sees me. She told me she had the deepest feeling that it saw her and that it knows. But as far as she knows, she didn't experience any missing time, and there was no reason to believe that any sort of abduction event had occurred. And so she heard a slight hum, and this thing once more retracted into the sky, and that was the end of it. Until 2 years later, on the same day, April 20th, at just before 6 a.m., she said she was taking the garbage out when something drew her eye from across the street. So in the early morning gloom, she said that she saw what looked like a 7 to 8 foot tall humanoid with a hunched over posture, and that it was sort of limping along. And she said that it was furry and it had these sort of gargoyle-like wings, these leathery wings, and that its movement was strange. If you can picture someone walking through a room lit by a strobe light, that's how it moved. It wasn't so much walking towards her as it was making these short jumps, really just disappearing and reappearing a little closer each time, and so terrifying. She fumbles for her keys and gets them into the lock, and finally manages to turn the tumbler and go inside. And as she does so, she turns around, certain that this thing is going to be right behind her, knowing that the fear that she felt as she described it was due to this sense of evil that she said this thing was emanating. And she turns around, and it was gone. She never saw it again. But when she saw what had been reported in Woodstock, she felt like she needed to come forward, and she needed to tell us what she had experienced. And so you can see, she sent us these photographs. She was also extremely helpful. Light had come down, so it just appeared out of the sky. She has no idea from where. She didn't see any craft or anything. And then, now approximately the same area was where she saw this creature on the exact same calendar day, April 20th, 2 years later. And so there's one more active sighting area that I want to talk about today. And I'm going to try to get through this because, checking the time, I want to make sure that I leave a little bit of time for questions, because people almost invariably have them, as I think is understandable considering how odd this is. Prairie Creek Reservoir in Indiana. In the summer of 2007, a witness said that she and her friend were returning to the dock after watching the sunset on her boat. And as they were approaching the dock, they said that they saw this human sort of standing at the end of the dock as they approached. And as they got closer to it, they realized that this was no human being. Something was off about it. And as it got even closer, this thing turned around and it looked at them with these glowing yellowish eyes. And she said that it spread its wings and flapped them a few times and took off. She said that this thing was about 5 or 6 feet tall, and it was grayish black, and that it was far too large to be any kind of bird. Interestingly enough, in the same area, just a few years later, she and her family, this was a popular vacation spot for them, by the way, her and her family witnessed what they described as a tin can-shaped UFO in the exact same area. They said that it was at dusk, and they saw this, cylindrical object floating in the sky, and it hovered there noiselessly until just vanishing without a trace in front of them. And so in the winter of 2011, a woman said that she was driving about 10 to 15 minutes east of the Prairie Creek Reservoir when she saw what appeared to be a human being crouched on the side of the road, or in the road, rather, I'm sorry. She said that she slowed down because she thought she was going to hit this thing. And it wasn't moving. As she got closer, she slowed down even more, and it still didn't move, and then she eventually had to stop her car completely. At that point, it turned around, and she saw what she described as its greenish, yellowish eyes, like a cat's eyes. And she said that it stood up on 2 legs, and then it stepped on her car, using it as a platform to launch itself into the air, and proceeded to glide away. Then on December 26, 2018, a witness and his wife were driving about a mile south of the reservoir when the witness said that he saw a large winged being flying above the treetops that caught his attention. So he described it as being about 6 to 7 feet tall, said it had bat-like wings, leathery skin, and what he described as an obvious face. And so people ask me what exactly he meant by that. And so what he's trying to confer is, what he's trying to convey is that he could tell that it had a face, but he wasn't able to see it well enough to have any idea what the details of that face were. So he could tell that it was humanoid in that it had the kind of sort of humanoid head that had a face, as we would consider it. And so he slams on the brakes, which scares the crap out of his wife. And he asks, his wife if she had seen it, and she didn't. She was so startled by his sudden stop that she missed it. And that was his sighting. Now, we were contacted by a man who lives in this same area, and he wanted to tell us about a series of glowing orbs he had seen around the Prairie Creek Reservoir between 1981 and the present day. He said that these orbs float relatively low, maybe 20 feet above the treetops on average, and he described their behavior as seemingly intelligent. he said that he had seen them react, change color, move, and even shut themselves off when they realized that he had seen them. And he said that he'd had over a dozen sightings over the years since '81, and that the colors of these objects ranged from red to orange to white, said that they were about 3 feet in diameter, and that they were completely silent. And because of that, he didn't think that they were any known terrestrial object. He didn't think that they were a plane or anything, like ball lightning or anything similar. And so he didn't know for certain, of course, that these were connected in any way to, our flying humanoid sightings, our Lake Michigan Mothman phenomenon, but he wanted to report it because it was weird and it was in the same area. And there were a couple other strange aspects of this sighting that he had, or his series of sightings rather, that he had noticed and he wanted to convey to us. And those were that if you drew a straight line from the Prairie Creek Reservoir, you would, to Mound State Park, you would cross where he saw these balls of light and an old Native American burial plot. And like I said, the Mound State Park, and so sort of his idea was that, maybe there was something to that. Maybe there was something about this area that made it sort of a window area, more likely to draw these types of phenomena. And I don't know that that's true, but I also don't know that it isn't. And so, what am I to make of this? What are any of this to make of this? I think that when we look at this, it seems sort of apparent to me that we're dealing with two seemingly disparate but concurrent phenomena. That of misidentified large birds and something far stranger, something potentially paranormal. And so, at this point, I feel fairly confident in saying that there's about a 50-50 split. About half of these sightings, I think, are most likely misidentified large birds. But those misidentified large bird sightings, they've led to something. They've led to these other much weirder sightings being reported because it was these misidentified large bird sightings that encouraged other people to come forward with their much weirder ones. They're what encouraged people to come forward with the historical sightings, of which I think very few, if perhaps none, are actually misidentified large birds. And so there's some kind of connection there. But what is that connection? Like I said, these misidentified large bird sightings led to a lot of other sightings being reported. They helped give this sighting flap, I think, the sort of popularity that made it available to people looking for a place to report these sightings. And so we have to ask ourselves, why? Now, John Keel, the guy who originally investigated the Point Pleasant sightings in West Virginia, he had this idea of something that he called the super spectrum. And so basically what that was is a spectrum of frequencies that he suspected the human mind could sometimes pick up on. And it was sort of through that medium that we experienced what we consider paranormal events. And he speculated about what sort of a being might be involved with this super spectrum, like who might be able to manipulate it. He called these beings ultra-terrestrials. And so I like to think of John Keel's super spectrum as a sort of collective consciousness, something that each of our consciousnesses are a part of, but also separate, like waves in an ocean. And then we have to consider, what would be the ecology of this collective consciousness? What could live in this ocean? It could be teeming with life, frankly. It could be teeming with life that appears in a variety of forms, that interacts with us directly through the medium of consciousness, that is capable of manipulating consciousness to appear as anything it wants, as in any type of form, explaining things from reptilian bat dragons to winged Bigfoot to, frankly, somebody like our Pilsen witness who came to me in all sincerity, completely authentically, to describe something that he was sure was a giant Batman, that in reality, from the evidence of his camera, was a large bird. I don't know that his experience wasn't that of actually seeing some sort of large flying bat. I don't know that something didn't want him to see a large flying bat to bring more attention to these sightings. I don't know a lot, frankly. And I can't say for sure if that's what's going on, but I can say that I'm going to continue looking for answers. I mean, and frankly, that's the best I can do, and I think that's the best any of us can do. So, you know, thanks for taking the time to listen to me, and you know, I think I've got a little less than 10 minutes. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. If not, you can find me. I will be roaming around the vendor areas afterwards if you want to talk about it, or you do end up having any questions. Otherwise, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
When was the last sighting of the Mothman?
So the last sighting that we received would have been early March of 2019.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so relatively recently. You know, I think that now the sightings have tapered off quite a bit since 2017. Now, I don't think, and there was no big event, which is the other reason that I sort of suspect that the collapse of the Silver Bridge really wasn't the end of it in Point Pleasant. I think this is something that, well, you know, we're probably not likely to ever to see the end of it, frankly. Yeah, they have tapered off, you know, quite a bit, which honestly is kind of the reason that, you know, I do consider that the influx of large birds had something to do with this, you know, because it just seems so strange to me that, you know, through things like climate change and the destruction of habitat, we would see these large birds suddenly, you know, in more urban areas, and we would get this huge number of sightings, which would lead to much weirder sightings, which would lead to a bunch of historical super weird sightings, and all of this other weirdness coming forth, and then, you know, now we're not really getting those anymore. Now, frankly, we're only getting weird ones, which it almost seems scripted in a way, like planned, frankly. You know, like somebody, you know, setting the spark to you know, get the timber going, frankly, you know, to sort of just set this thing on fire. So.
Do you think it's like an interdimensional creature of some sort, or?
I don't know. I don't know, honestly. I think that, well, I'll tell you this. I think that I don't.
Beam down or something, or?
What's that?
Like beam down or something?
Yeah, I don't know. You know, I think that what I do know is that there is very little likelihood that this represents an undiscovered animal species, because I don't think that there's any way that any terrestrial mundane animal would be able to have a breeding population of a size needed to sustain itself and live in these areas and not have us know about it. So yeah, I think that we have to be willing to entertain ideas like interdimensional. I think we have to be willing to entertain any kind of high strangeness ideas at this point.
Strange thing.
Yeah, well, you know, truth is stranger than fiction, right?
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, hey, thanks a lot. Appreciate it. All right, well, I think I'm about out of time, so if you guys have any questions later, come find me. Obviously, I love to talk about this stuff, and thank you again.